In the first hour of the invasion, within this specific AO, this 100 by 100 mile segment of the south central sector of the entire invasion, this El Paso Fort Bliss sector, multiple battlefield occurrences were happening simultaneously in terms of the external components consisting of the 14th PLA Group Army and the PAP's 18th Light Armored Brigade, which was stationed along the border at its jumping off points, as alongside of the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion, itself likewise stationed at a jumping off point adjacent to a border post manned by American paramilitary border forces as well as customs paramilitary forces, many of which had been sent to bolster the original force maintaining these border posts as a heightened security measure, although this would fail drastically as the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion would deploy one of its 6 subordinate combat companies, along with mortar support and FPV drone support and robotics support from its Special Weapons Company, with its headquarters company sitting back and directing and allowing the attack to take place. This one combat company hiked into battle a short distance from the border post and aided in the attack launched by the 18th PAP Light Armored Brigade's Artillery Battalion, which itself was just across the border in Mexico at their pre-prepared firing positions, as this related directly to the PAP's Artillery Battalion, itself equipped with 122 millimeter howitzers, equipping most of its 7 firing batteries, with only 1 firing battery equipped with the 130 millimeter howitzers, or essentially the Type 59-1s. And the 122 millimeter howitzers were the Type 83 122 millimeter towed howitzers, not to be confused with the Type 83 152 millimeter self-propelled guns, which the PLA operated. These howitzers, of course, again, having been passed down from the PLA to the PAP's artillery branch, as these forces hurriedly fired their various fire missions and smashed the border posts in conjunction with their own additional PAP ground forces and the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion's 1 combat company deployed to fight, they totally overran these border facilities and crushed these paramilitary elements and armed civilians living across the border. As this was being conducted, while all the battles were raging in the fairly large city of well over 100,000 people, being El Paso, the large battles raging in the city itself and all along the post and within it by this point, the 141st Aviation Regiment of the PLA's 14th Group Army, its 1 transport battalion, its subordinate companies equipped with Z-20 utility helicopters and other companies equipped with the older Z-8s were rushed to pick up the entire Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion upon their completion of their operation at the border post and fly them deep into the country, into New Mexico, to drop them off in the Organ Mountains, a mountain range of the Rocky Mountains within the Las Cruces area. This is where their high-value target capture or KIA operation was to take place. They were to be dropped off in a high valley within the mountains, the high valley being approximately 5,200 feet above sea level, as these Organ Mountains themselves were quite high, with the highest peak measuring some 8,982 feet, or very nearly 9,000 feet above sea level, with the average mountain heights of the other mountains peaks being 5,600 feet to 6,800 feet above sea level, with even some mountains 7,000 feet or higher, although the majority were between, again, 5,600 and 6,800. Well, the particular mountain being used as a base of operations for this high-value target, American local militia leader and his inner core of his militia, with others being engaged outside of Las Cruces and even Alamogordo by Pakistani forces, the core of the militia itself was hidden away within the Organ Mountains, within their redoubt, their stronghold. And it was up to the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion in order to not only liquidate this inner core of trained and decently equipped American militia forces, but also to either capture or KIA its leader, as ample intel had been gathered on this group, like many other groups of armed civilians throughout the land, as well as on the American armed forces and paramilitary, and anything that would be considered any type of threat, including this small but well-endowed American militia in terms of its positioning and in terms of its capabilities. Capturing or eliminating its leadership was of the utmost importance and was left to the Special Operations Forces because of the difficulties of the terrain, the difficulties of the carrying out the operation as a whole in the mountains, and the inability for many of the heavier assets to actually get up there into such a high place. Hence the need for the Special Operations Forces to act as a sort of combat dental floss and really get in there and do the job. As the transport helicopters flew relatively close to the border, where the city of El Paso could be seen being hit by artillery as well as smoking and rubbled ruins in the background, these helicopters flew from their positions outside of Juarez City right here and flew all the way up to the border to pick up the whole Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion in order to now fly them deep into New Mexico in order to drop them off in the Organ Mountains. Their drop-off point would be 5,200 feet above sea level in a high valley, where again they would hike to their target. The purpose of this was, again, very drastic difficulties in reaching their objective in terms of the terrain. These mountain slopes were exceedingly rocky and also tree covered in many areas, with ponderosa trees as well as aspen trees. There were literal forests atop of the mountains, and vehicle use was extremely difficult. While there were roads going up into some of these mountains where there were cabins and retreats and even a few industrial farming operations, like a large chicken farm, the roads were exceedingly limited and couldn't support a massive armored operation, as many of the assets being utilized were heavily armored infantry type forces, heavy armored tank forces, and anti-tank vehicles, and more, and they could not easily get up those roads in strength in order to carry out this operation without the Americans knowing and fleeing from them. Hence the need to hike up the mountains in stealth, where they would be relayed constant intel being fed to them by their own orbiting WZ-7 drone as well as satellite, and all processed by the Chinese ultra-advanced artificial intelligence processing systems. And also, while there could be air support from nearby Su-57 fighter aircraft, which were considered multi-role fifth-generation fighters, they would not be utilized by the PLA Special Operations Forces, as the entire battalion was hiking up these very steep mountains. They had robots that were quad-legged, quadrupedal, that would carry their equipment up the mountain for them, as in the heavy or special weapons companies' mortar tubes and base plates and mortars, in addition to the FPV drone operators and their drones with their munitions attached, as well as their other assets such as general purpose machine guns and even a magazine belt-fed crew-serve grenade launcher. Essentially, the QLZ-04 crew-serve grenade machine gun and its tripod. As well as this, there were, of course, the armed robots operated by the Heavy Weapons Company's robotics platoon. There were 2 mortar platoons firing 82mm mortars, as well as their FPV platoon of their Heavy Weapons Company or Special Weapons Company. The headquarters platoon was directing the operation as far as taking their personal PDA-like combat data links along with them, as well as was the leadership of each of the subordinate companies, like the company captains and their XOs or lieutenants. They would carry along their own combat data links, and even down to the squad level, the squad leader would also carry his own combat data link in the form of this PDA. That way, the troops were constantly fed a steady stream of real-time battlefield intelligence and could react and adapt accordingly as the operation was to move. Another aspect of this operation that made it so vital was the proximity to the major road junction of Las Cruces itself, as these militia-like forces could never be permitted to become a dangerous thorn in the side, as in becoming saboteurs and operating from their mountain redoubt and going down the mountains to hit and run against lighter supply convoys before racing back up to their relative safety. While yes, heavy airstrikes would be able to be called upon them and would likely eliminate many of them, they still needed to be taken out from the ground because it needed to be an absolute, as in there needed to be total confirmation that these elements were wiped out and no longer a threat to the external invaders or the local occupation forces, which were to become the 14th Pakistani Infantry Division of the Pakistani Army. As these forces were dropped off, the helicopters, the Z-8s and Z-20s, which were newer, were flown to refuel at the CCP logistical property in Las Cruces, which was guarded by a Pakistani combat engineering battalion and was manned by a Chinese paramilitary force, being National Militia, a company of supply troops of their National Militia forces, or essentially a paramilitary version of a National Guard-like element. These supply forces, in conjunction with their Pakistani combat engineer security, maintained the operations as far as logistics were concerned within this specific area. As the Hilo-borne forces landed at special landing zones, they were refueled and maintenance services were conducted upon them before they flew back to their main base where they originated from within Mexico, as they needed to land and pick up some more logistics pertaining to just their specific regiment's logistics and then carry them back to their landing zone and establish themselves there, as upon completion of their mission within the city, The combat helicopters of the attack helicopter battalion, as well as the armed reconnaissance battalion carrying out support of the Pakistani Trojan combat engineers and mechanized infantry attacking the main post, as well as supporting their own 48th Infantry Division's advance into El Paso. These forces would likewise fly north and land at the logistical base. This all being a part of the larger advance of the entire 14th Group Army and followed by the 18th PAP Light Armored Brigade. As this was going on, as all the combat was occurring, the most potent unit of the entire 14th Group Army was not even used in combat. The 144th Armored Division raced past the border and past all the combat occurring on the flanks undertaken by the PAP 18th Light Armored Brigade and headed straight for Las Cruces. Many of their units now traveling on windy mountain roads on their way to the I-10 bridge, upon which they would exit these country roads that eventually went up through the mountains, this being a headquarters element armed with the Tiger MRAPs, which they had a turret for a machine gun or even a HJ-08 anti-tank missile as a crew serve. This being part of a headquarters element of a unit of the 144th Armored Division. As these units traveled through the mountains within the first hour, while the Stalking Leopard Special Operations wrapped up their mission in conjunction with the PAP's artillery fire from Mexico, landing on the border post of the American paramilitary forces, these Special Operations forces of this battalion, of the Stalking Leopard Spec Ops Battalion, were now being flown and dropped off, again, 5,200 feet in the Organ Mountains to begin their operation. As they hiked up the mountainsides, and their robots with them carrying their mortar tubes and base plates for their 82mm mortars, much of their ammunition supplies, and even their heavy crew serve QLZ-04 grenade machine gun, which would be operated by part of the Special Weapons Platoon, as their guard section would maintain these weapons when they would form a perimeter around their mortar sections and FPV drone operators. As these forces moved up to surround the mountain peak, which the mountain peak here in the Organ Mountains, where these militia forces were operating in, was 7,400 feet, as in that was the height above sea level that their base of operations was located within. These Special Operations forces were definitely the perfect forces for this operation. As they moved into the mountain, this being a large peak of the mountain, this being a factory farm, a chicken farm, this being the parking lot, this being the road that leads up to it, and this going even higher, and this going even higher, and this is even higher, constituting the peak, as well as over here, which went even higher on this side. This mountain peak was being surrounded by the entire Special Operations Battalion as they all moved in place to carry out this massive undertaking. Within this specific segment of the larger battle, this is only one side of the mountain peak, this being a 1.5 by half mile area here. This was a large mountain upon which the American militia forces were operating within. A portion of the heavy weapons company established themselves lower on the side of the mountain. There was ponderosa and aspen forests mixed in with these mountains here within the area, and there were driveways that went lower to lower elevation to where there was actual roads around the mountain that wound around the mountain. And up here, the same thing was the case with this road, this essentially this driveway for this factory farm area, which went down and connected to an actual road, a formal road that wound around the mountain in a valley, a high valley. There were cabins in different areas on this mountain peak. There was one here, a cabin here, a cabin here, one here, and one here, as well as another over here. Some had driveways going to them, while others were more in solitude, such as where the high-value target himself, the leader of this group of militia, was hiding within this cabin, which had no driveway leading to it. The WZ-7 drone, high above the mountains, a very high-altitude recon drone, was orbiting this entire mountain area, flying around and around to feed steady intel to the troops on the ground. As these mortar troops opened fire of the mortar platoon, there was a total of 10 mortars between these two mortar sections of the platoon. There was another half of this mortar platoon on the opposite side of the mountain peak, as there were other companies surrounding this mountain peak. As, again, the highest point on this mountain, which was right here, as well as another portion just off the map, was roughly between 7,300 and 7,400 feet above sea level. And these were very steep inclines, going up hundreds of feet, as indicated by these brown slopes. Down low here in this draw, or spur, this draw, there was a forest area right here and another portion right here. There was forest and wooded areas up here, much higher up, hundreds of feet up, as well as around this cabin and the driveway. There was forest, ponderosa, and aspen trees mostly. The ponderosa being a sort of coniferous tree that masked a lot of IR signature, which caused a little bit of trouble for these special operations forces, as the Americans could hide their IR signature much better staying beneath those types of trees, making it exceedingly difficult for the infrared imaging systems aboard the drones, including the local drones operated at the squad level, as every squad had its own quadcopter reconnaissance drone, like every other PLA unit. These forces were very difficult to see when under the relative safety of the ponderosas and aspen trees under the canopy of them. There was forest right here, and these 5 were in the forest. This being a large battle, this is the north and this is the south. The battle can also be viewed this way from the west facing east. As a whole platoon, or 5 squads, 3 here and 2 here, joined by their 4 robots carrying ample ammunition for their various weapons, these special operations forces being armed typically with their own domestic weaponry, although as special forces they had access to foreign weaponry if they so chose, although in this instance they preferred their own domestic weaponry, as the 5.8 by 42 millimeter small caliber high velocity rifle cartridge was an extremely effective cartridge, and it typically outperformed both the American 5.56 by 45 and the Russian 5.45 by 39 cartridges. It was a solid round, and it was heavy enough to stay stable while in flight and strong enough to have a little bit of a knockdown effect combined with the yawing and twisting effect upon hitting a fleshly target. As these forces advanced through this lower elevated area, this lower elevation, they began to scale the sides of this peak here, as this whole thing is a mountain peak ostensibly, with the highest elevation again being found here and here, as well as off the map. As these forces went up the sides of this peak, the slopes. They received generous fire support from their mortar sections of one of two mortar platoons, as well as FPV drone operators sending out FPV drones with their explosive packages, as in these were quadcopter drones that carried an explosive charge which could destroy vehicles and personnel equally, as well as their robotics platoon of the Special Weapons Company operating their both armed robots, which are not in this specific portion of the battle and are just off the map in another area, but also their weight-bearing robots, which carried their heavier weapons and equipment and ammunition, as is being done here. Right here, there are two squads in a long line formation weaving their way up the side of this peak, while here, in two double column formations following a wedge formation, there are three squads of the same platoon as these two, 5 squads per platoon, scaling the side of this peak, hiking up the peak, taking fire now from the Americans, while the Americans are being obliterated by mortar strikes fired by the two mortar sections of one of two mortar platoons. The heavy weapons company being broken up and deployed to different sides of this entire battle. This is only a small segment of the larger battle occurring on the mountain, as the entire peak of the mountain was surrounded by all of the companies comprising the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion in the southern part, as occurring in the north, while these forces move into position, scale the peaks, taking fire from the Americans, but dishing out small arms fire themselves from their QBU-88 general purpose machine guns, which are belt-fed and fire the heavy 5.8 by 42 millimeter ammunition, the DBP-88, which is a 77 grain round, while the light machine gun carried, or the belt-fed QJS-161, fires the standard DBP-87, or the 64 grain round of the 5.8 by 42 millimeter, but it has a higher rate of fire as a light machine gun, similar to the SAW or the M249 carried by the American Army forces as their light machine gun. They were armed with Type 18 hand grenades and also FSLO2 smoke grenades, which they would pop smoke for their helos to pick them up when the mission was accomplished, as that would be the next order of operations upon the completion of the overall battle. But while the battle was occurring, this was now 2 hours into the invasion as a whole, as these forces finally made it to surround the entire mountain peak and maneuver their way up to the very top, while dishing out punishing mortar fire on American militia forces and FPV firepower against forces on even higher elevation that were trying to use the terrain to their advantage, but were seen by both the quadcopter recon drones operated at the very lowest level of squad level, and also the high-flying WZ-7 high-altitude reconnaissance drone, and their own satellite images, as China had the most military satellites on Earth and could literally use all of them essentially to monitor the American battlefield as they were orbiting high overhead. As the battle was going on, the platoon down here on the southern end left their positions around the platoon guarding the perimeter of the heavy weapons company's assets in the area, being two mortar sections of one of two mortar platoons, which a mortar platoon was made up of 4 mortar sections. So there was half of a mortar platoon here and half of an FPV drone platoon here, as well as a security platoon surrounding the area to ensure that these forces were protected, and they were armed with the magazine with belt-fed QLZ-04 crew-serve grenade machine gun, as well as their QBU-88 general-purpose machine guns, and of course they had their light machine guns, their QJS-161s, and their standard rifles, with every designated marksman in every squad, or essentially the squad sniper, having a QCW-05 submachine gun for close quarters battles, while being armed with a QBU-88 sniper rifle, whereas the QJY-88 was the belt-fed general-purpose machine gun operated by these squads. As these forces, this platoon, advanced in the south, it's comprising squads, one advancing this way into this Ponderosa, Aspen wooded area and taking fire from Americans higher up on the peak, who in turn were identified, and a group of which were destroyed by this FPV drone here, as indicated, while another large grouping of them was destroyed by mortar fire, causing those in the center to retreat, while also taking fire from lower elevation from the squad here that maneuvered into position here. And even while this was going on, these two squads here, this one and the one right behind it, both in wedge formations, bounded and covered very close together, which is why this arrow indicates two squads moving, while mortars were directed to hit this grouping of American militiamen behind this small cabin. And they were taking fire before they were hit. These two squads were under fire before they were hit and destroyed by mortars. And the mortars severely damaged this cabin, which was very close to the blast radius. These two squads then maneuvering around the ripped up cabin, and also were taking fire at the time. As all of these events are occurring at roughly the same time, and insofar as events occurring in the southern portion of the map and the northern portion, showing them in order is difficult, but as this was happening, these moves were happening with the mortars, and the mortars hitting up here, while there was fire taken by this squad and these two squads that maneuvered around the side of this now ripped up cabin after the mortar hit and destroyed these Americans in conjunction with their fire earlier, as they had moved right here up this driveway area here. And even as all of that was going on and these forces retreated into this industrial chicken farming compound higher up on the elevation from this lower elevated area, these squads here, this one here, had ran through this wooded area and scaled up the side of this slope, while this squad here was already under fire from these four Americans shooting down at them in return fire, as this squad snuck up out of the woods, up the peak, and eliminated them in conjunction with this squad, who then maneuvered around this way, taking fire from these forces, as well as this squad turning and taking fire, while this FPV drone had already destroyed these guys here. They were taking fire from these guys here. But these guys were eliminated by this squad and this squad, vectoring their fire this way and this way, as this squad was in a wedge formation, like an arrow type formation, and could fire in two different directions or even straight ahead, while this side of the squad fired at these Americans hiding in the wood line here, as shown. Their small quadcopter recon drone having found some movement from them, they fired upon them and lit this side of the wooded area up, while this side of the wedge formation, in conjunction with this whole squad now taking cover on the side of this now ripped up cabin from the FPV drone blasting these guys, were opening fire in simultaneously on this group of 3 and this group of 5 hiding in the woods. As that ended, they both maneuvered to the edge of this slope and were opening fire down at these forces here, as indicated by the red. They were being fired at, but were also likewise taking fire from across this valley from these armed American forces here. As all of that was going on, in the north, as these 3 squads of the Special Operations troops scaled this slope while having taken fire, their small quadcopter recon drones radioed in the coordinates of all of these forces here, and mortars were dropped on them at the same time as these 2 squads of the same platoon had come around and were already fighting and eliminating these armed Americans around this wood line, and also an FPV drone aided in their destruction as well, allowing them to move in from behind while they moved up the slope, and they all opened fire as the mortars were striking the area, allowing them to then advance 2 squads this way, and they were also having taken fire as they moved this way from this group here, as indicated by the arrow being surrounded in green, which caused an FPV drone to come in and help eliminate this grouping by this cabin. As all of that was occurring, this wedge formation had also likewise moved into position as these 2 squads from this different platoon of these 3 total squads, 2 here and 3 here, 5. This one from a different platoon had moved into position here, taking fire from atop this peak, while a closing L formation of these 2 of this same platoon that this wedge formation grouping was a part of, and the staggered column formation here was a part of, that eliminated these 5 armed American militiamen hiding in the woods. This closing L formation had taken fire as indicated by the green lines around these troops, this occurring at the opening of this map showing. So at the initiation of this segment being shown of this particular battle, this closing L formation of these 2 squads of 1 platoon were vectoring their fire 2 different ways as they had closed in on this cabin, which was surrounded by armed American militiamen trying to take cover in the prone position behind it, and in front of it, which were eliminated immediately, as this red indicates, the red surrounding these green dots being armed militiamen, while the closing L finished off those hiding behind the cabin, as the vector of fire coming from this way and this way got everyone on these 2 sides trying to hide behind it, as fire came in from this way and fire came in from this way, eliminating those here and here simultaneously as they closed in and advanced, and to sweep the now empty cabin, as there were no forces alive, as the cabin itself also took heavy small arms fire from these forces and hand grenades, as in the Type 18 hand grenades. And as that was occurring, this staggered column that had eliminated these 5 armed American militiamen early on now advanced around this fighting having had concluded, advanced around this wooded area as they were moving already while this fight was wrapping up. And by the time they got to here, they were taking fire from these armed American militiamen on top of the peak of this summit here. While these forces, these 2 squads, now combined after having cleared this area, advanced towards the peak from this way, while these 2 squads advanced from this way, bounding and covering tactically upon taking fire, and returned fire between these 2 squads firing up the summit, while this same part of their platoon, this squad here that had advanced here and was taking fire and firing up at the summit, and this way originally, before all of these events occurred over here with this other platoon advancing from two different directions to close on the forces here with generous mortar support and FPV drone support in two different areas. This separate squad was now advancing up the summit in conjunction with the fire being vectored properly as per their small quadcopter recon drones, aiding these squads in where and when to fire their small arms so as to not produce friendly fire casualties. As again, the Chinese had a very advanced AI data processing system for the battlefield, which updated the combat data links and also informed commanders on the ground how best to deploy and use their troops and how to vector their fire properly in fluid battlefield conditions to avoid friendly fire casualties. That's a new aspect of modern warfare, and it greatly reduced Chinese friendly fire incidents and allowed them to better destroy enemy forces better than ever before. As these forces now moved, these forces now moved up here of their section that was on the far west of this platoon here. This section moved up and was taking fire from other Americans on the other parts of the summit. And this squad advanced up with this squad, and both were firing this way, while this squad now advanced into this area and was firing up this way, as indicated by this. And they were also firing at Americans on this summit right here, as they were now high up in elevation near the summits, the peaks of this large mountain. And they were taking fire from these Americans ahead by this cabin here, firing at them through the woods while they fired. They returned and exchanged fire back and forth between these squads here that had moved in from here and now here, with 5 total squads moving in with these 2 squads, making 7 squads, as in this entire platoon of 5 squads having had flushed out the top of this peak, with these 2 squads having flushed out this area with the aid of the mortar fire and also the FPV drones, having moved up this way and cleared this side of the peak in conjunction with these forces here. And now these 2 squads from here, leaving their 3 other squads here of their platoon, moved in to assist this whole platoon of 5 squads, making 7 total at this arrow as they all grouped up together. And 2 moved out this way to provide fire support this way, or this way to guard their rear flanks as they advanced towards the cabin, bounding and covering. As they did that, all that was left after liquidating the defenders of the cabin, all that was left was the militia leader, the high-value target inside. A section or a squad broke into 2 stack teams, and one stack team watched the sides of the cabin while another kicked in the door and basically got into a scuffle with the leader as the leader tried to open fire on them, but the leader was fired on and severely wounded as he was hit not only in his armor plating, which didn't kill him as it saved his life, but was hit multiple times in the shoulder and in the leg, and was also rifle checked in the face by the stack team point man. In turn, he was zip-tied and actually was dragged out to be put on one of their equipment-carrying robots and carried away by the robot, strapped down to it to be carried away, so as to ensure that he could be brought down from this high up in the mountain, and done so relatively with ease, as the man was wounded and needed to be brought back to proper medical forces, combat medics of the Special Operations Battalion as a whole, to be properly treated, as they could only do bandage work on him in the cabin and do some ordinary combat lifesaver type of operations as far as maintaining his life and keeping him from perishing. He was captured alive and was zip-tied and carried away by one of the quadrupedal or quad-legged robots. As that was occurring, elements of other companies had moved into the area here and here, which were helping to engage the forces still on this peak, who, by the way, even as this was occurring, were still engaging them from this side and this side. But mortars were hastily called upon this position here on the top of this summit, as well as over here, and even an FPV drone was sent to hit the very top of this peak here and eliminate these 10 on this very highest peak where this mortar splashed and eliminated these guys. This is very difficult and tedious to see, so this will be moved in on to properly look at. The mortars, of course, eliminated all the lingering forces around this particular cabin here, while these other forces moved in as the last moves of this particular portion of the battle here, and assisted in eliminating the forces, the American forces and holdouts hiding on this summit, while also they had earlier taken fire from forces here that eliminated some of them over here, while still the forces outside were fired at from them, and a firefight was still going on, even with these forces firing from over there, again trying to support their rear flank. While that was occurring, these forces moved in from a whole different company and proceeded to charge up the summit and eliminate these remaining forces on top of this peak here. As these arrows have green on the tips of the arrows, meaning that they were taking fire and they were being engaged, and of course they were returning fire and eliminating these forces with a combo of 2 FPV drones and mortar strikes landing on top and around this summit here, as well as there were mortar strikes and here, and here, all together, eliminating a fairly decent-sized group here. All in all, under the mortar strikes themselves and the edges of the strikes, which would have been shrapnel KIAs, these were at least 20 of these armed militiamen. Now, these armed militiamen were equipped with standard civilian types of small arms, being your sporting rifles or semi-automatic military-grade rifles, as well as hunting rifles, and a vast array of different pistol types, and even some wielding certain different shotguns. But for the most part, they were aware that they needed firearms that could really reach out and touch. So hunting rifles and sporting rifles obviously were the main choices for arming this group. Many of them did possess either body armor or plate carriers for their protection. And some were very difficult to eliminate right off the bat in terms of small arms fire. They were decently trained and pretty well armed for what they were and organized, but they were simply unable to withstand a special operations force with full mortar support from their 82 millimeter mortars, FPV drones with very high explosive ordnance, in conjunction with their crew serve weapons, general purpose machine guns in the case of the QJY-88 belt fed general purpose machine guns, also hand grenades, the Type 18s that were used, as well as even the designated marksman in every squad, or essentially the squad's sniper, for lack of a better term, would be armed with the QBU-88, which was a standard sniper rifle, not like the Jiangxi rifle, but it was a bullpup rifle, a different sniper's rifle the Chinese had. And this rifle had a lot of range and a lot of good accuracy, as the twisting in the barrel was designed for the standard DPB-87 64 grain round, and the round had a roughly 700 meter range, which was quite long. And the designated marksman in every squad, as every squad had a quadcopter recon drone, could be given the exact coordinates of targets when they were out in the open, and could help direct the aiming of not only the ordinary small arms that these teams utilized, but also their designated marksmen and their precise fire against their enemy. Having recon drones at the squad level really ensured total superiority in battle. Very, very few casualties occurred against the Chi-Coms in this particular battle. Although these American militiamen were armed to the teeth and well organized for a civilian militia, they were definitely outgunned, even up here in the mountains, as these mortars, FPV drones, hand grenades, even general purpose machine guns and sniper rifles, as well as light machine guns and hand grenades and barrel fired 35 millimeter grenades from some of the rifles wielded by these special operators definitely ensured a rapid defeat. The American forces didn't possess any types of grenades or machine guns or anything like that, but the closest things they had was the civilian type of RPK model, which they could utilize as a sort of squad LMG in a sense, as that was exactly what it was, only it was semi-automatic. A few of their groups had weapons like this and tried to use them, and although they did at times hit the Chi-Com special operators, the body armor of these special operators generally ensured that they were well protected. Again, no KIAs on the Chi-Com side, although there were some WIAs, as a lot of lead was exchanged between both sides of this battle. And in the south of this battle, upon having defeated the American militiamen on this peak and fired across the valley, the two different squads involved bounded and covered under each other's fire. This squad stayed up here to lay fire down on this group here, while the other squad went down into the valley, down the slope, and up the other slope into this industrial chicken farming area here. These forces were basically retreating into the area and were mortared and hit with an FPV drone, 2 FPV drones from the FPV drone section over here. They launched their 4 FPV drones into this general area here. One here, one here, one here, and one here. And the mortar strikes all over the outer area where the chickens would feed and roam, as these were cage-free chickens. They roamed the field and were obliterated by the mortars, just like the militiamen that tried to take cover here, as early on these 3 were annihilated, these 4 here were annihilated by these 2 mortar strikes. And as these men retreated early on from the fire they took from down here, from the mortar fire, the FPV drone here early on, and they retreated, they went into the farm as well, the industrial farm, and were hit by mortars and largely eliminated, although there were enough left to exchange fire with these 2 squads as both finally got down there, bounding and covering, as one squad went down in the valley, stopped as they fired, and they bounded again, and they kept firing, to ensure that they could get there. And then when this squad took position here, they held their position and watched the area and fired into this way while the other squad came to join them. And the remaining survivors of this group here were firing back and forth while the rest of them were finally eliminated upon these two squads coming up here and firing back at them from here, from the wood line. They opened fire on them from there and vectored their fire this way and this way. So they didn't quite hit each other, but they were very close. But precision was a specialty of these special operation forces, as they could even accurately shoot targets, moving targets from a moving vehicle. That was how good their marksmanship skills were, literally. So it was no problem for them to vector their firepower even when it was relatively close to one another. They could ensure that they didn't hit each other, as well as having their quadcopter reconnaissance drones to aid them in this effort, as their PDA combat data links held by every squad leader ensured that they knew where everybody was, friend and foe. As these troops got to this point, this was already hit. This parking lot of this factory farm here, lower on the mountain slope, was hit here by a mortar and destroyed this truck, these 4 men, and a man on this ATV along with the ATV. This mortar was devastating. And the last move of this battle was these two squads breaking up in two, one going and checking the buildings, the other going into the factory farm area and holding a position here for securing the area, security, while this other squad of the two that came down went into the buildings, checked this building like stack team style, stacking up along the wall, kicking in the door, running in 5 at a time, checking, coming out this way, kicking in the door, checking this building, and this building was checked by these two squads, kicking in the door here, 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 and then here. As the final move of this was this other element of this other company that was on the other side of the mountain. Out of all 6 combat companies, the special weapons company and the headquarters company, one of the other combat companies entered through this area here. While these two squads broke up, when this one held security here, kind of like down here, one held security here while the other checked. This one held security while the other checked. And the whole area was cleared of enemy forces. As again, higher up on the mountain, the leader was taken alive, although very horribly wounded, and he was patched up by CHICOM special operators on the scene from these different squads that surrounded this cabin, and was sent back, zip-tied and strapped down to one of the quad-legged robots that carried him down the mountain to proper combat medics who would attend to his needs and ensure that he could be carried again to the extraction zone, where the helicopters would once again come and pick these forces up and carry them to the Las Cruces area CHICOM properties, along with their high-value target being captured. As on the other side of this mountain peak, other battles just like this were going on. As again, this was a large area, a 1.5 by half mile area. This was a large area of this mountain peak. And again, this was only one side of the whole mountain. There was a whole other side to it. And the entire mountain was surrounded even lower by other companies that fanned out and secured the area to make sure that none of these militiamen escaped, because this was only half of the group of 290 of them. It was only half of the group. So on the other side of the mountain peak, where this road continued before it went down to lower elevation and connected to the mountain road that was a bit lower in elevation, as well as these driveways doing the same of these cabins, the fighting was raging on the other side, and part of it was even seen here, where these forces came around and helped these forces finish them off that were right here on this part of the peak, and so on and so forth, with the last moves being these forces coming in here and aiding in the liquidation of these forces on this peak, along with their precision mortar fire and FPV drones. So essentially, when this battle ended, the objective of the HVT had been secured. The objective was completed. He was captured alive and wasn't eliminated, although a KIA would have been considered a victory as well. And he was taken as a POW, as a high-value target. Upon being patched up by the combat medics, he was flown to the Chinese FOB on the CCP property, being used as the main logistical property, as these helos then flew the whole Special Operations Battalion to disembark them on the CCP regime large logistical property. This only being one little part of it. There was more. This is just a section of it. 2 barns and connexes full of supplies, pallets full of supplies, parts and munitions and ammunition and food and fuel, water, again, parts for vehicles, all of that. POL products, like your lubricants for vehicles, your oils, your other stuff, everything you need, hydraulic fluid, all of that. They had all of that in these barns. And also there were these white greenhouses that were domed greenhouses that could go on for thousands of meters. They hid their vehicles underneath things like that, and also in barns and pole barns, and even in secret underground areas, old warehouse properties purchased by the CCP regime. That is where their Trojan forces hid all their heavy weapons for the day of the invasion. Farmhouse was a command building for this forward operating base, CCP property, supply property. When these forces were flown back from their mission, they prepared with their headquarters units vehicles as the headquarters company of the entire battalion operated the vehicles of the battalion. They prepared to mount up in their ground vehicles similar to these vehicles that the PLA had. The headquarters company of the battalion operated MRAPs and also heavily armored Lynx ATVs, or all-terrain vehicles, which could be armor-plated or had the option of riding without armor. But due to this being a heavy combat situation as a full-on invasion, they opted to use the armor plating kits on these Lynx all-terrain vehicles, which were a bit smaller than a Humvee, just by a small amount of space, but were generally utilized in the same way as a Humvee gun truck was used, with a turret gunner and some armored plating, as Humvees were up-armored over the years of their use. This battle that occurred here, and then the completion of the mission down to the extraction site in the high mountain valley, was a total of 4 hours, including the hiking time. It was a 4-hour operation, as this whole battle lasted a total of 5.5 hours. Everything going on in this entire battle space lasted 5.5 hours. But this, from the first hour, the end of the first hour, into a 4-hour-long mission. After hour 1, going into hour 2, they were picked up after they had done their border ops, dropped off. 4 hours went by from where they were extracted and brought back to the CCP supply property to prepare, as this was the major invasion road junction for all the externals, to mount in their land vehicles for the trip up the interstate, as it pertained to the Special Operations Battalion, as the whole 14th Group Army was preparing, including the forces of the 48th down here, to get on the interstate and travel up I-25 to aid in the Trojans' operations going on up north as heavy-handed reinforcements for the Trojans already operating deep inland. The Special Operations mission was a resounding success, and by the time it was completed, it was hour 5 of the entire invasion, as again, 1 hour was spent at the border before being picked up and flown in, and then 4 more hours of the operation, which made it 5 hours, and then they were brought back to prepare for their ride north, which would have occurred at the 5.5-hour mark. But even as all of this was unfolding, there was another operation going on by this point, as all of this was unfolding, going on. While it was going on, within hour 1, the PAP 18th Light Armor Brigade had already defeated all the armed resistance on the border, its artillery battalion moving inland into the country to begin to shell enemy forces, and moving again to shell forces further inland as the light armor brigades combat elements of 4 different armored battalions and 2 mechanized or armored infantry battalions that were just completely armored infantry forces in tracked vehicles moved north in 2 prongs to clear the flanks of the western portion of the whole operation of any armed resistance, especially around the interstate. Again, highways were of vital critical importance to the invaders. They had the support of an orbiting CH-4A armed reconnaissance drone, which is a high-altitude drone but could fire or even drop air-based air-to-ground munitions at targets on the ground. And even after the munitions were expended, it could stay in the area to continue to give vital intelligence on fluid battlefield operations. By hour 2, the artillery had already moved again and was fighting with the 2 different prongs, 2 different armed American groups of 200 apiece, roughly. And all of this was now occurring between hours 2 and 3, all while the operation up here had been going on in conjunction with the massive battle going on the post of Fort Bliss and within the city of El Paso itself, a fairly large city of well over 100,000 people. The city was now in ruins and resembled Berlin in 1945, with the Chi-Coms having totally smashed it and pummeled it to total ruination with artillery strikes of the howitzer and rocket varieties in an enormous preliminary barrage and continuing precision strikes even after that to aid their ground troops of the 48th Infantry Division. This battle will continue with an operation that occurred between hours 4 and 5, which was the battle at Deming, as one of the 2 prongs of the PAP forces of 2 armored battalions and a mechanized or armored infantry battalion raced to the north after having smashed an armed civilian pocket earlier on, advancing to Deming under the cover of their own artillery battalion's fire in conjunction with the other wing of the assault, the other 2 light armored battalions and mechanized or armored infantry battalion having defeated an additional pocket of armed civilians out in the countryside, advancing to the highway to clear the adjacent areas of Interstate 10 of any and all armed resistance, as some had been found. With the battle that occurred in the mountains, in the Organ Mountains, it should be understood that the city of Kabul in Afghanistan sits at a roughly 5,870 feet above sea level on average as it relates to the Kabul city in Afghanistan, whereas Santa Fe, New Mexico is 7,200 feet on average above sea level. It's even higher than the Mile High City, as it's called, of Denver. The countryside in this area, including the Organ Mountains, were very sharp in terms of height and elevation, with, again, their highest peak in the Organ Mountains being some 8,982 feet, this just being one range of the larger Rocky Mountain ranges. The Special Operations Forces were certainly worn out after having had hiked up very steep terrain to attain their objectives, and also all the fighting that they conducted. And the troops got a well-deserved rest upon returning to the FOB to mount their vehicles, with many sleeping within their vehicles as they prepared to follow the other forces of their 14th Group Army up the interstate, rotating gunners and drivers throughout the entire trip so that all the men could get rest, as again, this entire invasion involved a strict timetable, a strict regime of advances and timing as everything had to be faster than ever before in history, a rapidity never before experienced or seen in human history, as the forces would continue their drive up north. Although, fortunately for this invasion prong, to get to the Trojan forces they had to provide reinforcements to, they had the least distance to travel out of all the invasion prongs in the south central sector. So it would essentially be less than 2 days when they would arrive at their objective of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, taking them really only 1 day to get there at the speed they would be traveling, some nearly 32 miles an hour up the interstate. The next video in this series covers the battle at Deming, a relatively large town along Interstate 10 that needed to be cleared of armed civilian bands that were now manifesting in this area. Just to the east of Deming, where the other prong of PAP forces would handle them, of 3 battalions, and another prong of the PAP would handle the forces in Deming. That video is next, of the Battle of El Paso Fort Bliss sub-series of the whole documentary of the Texas campaign invasion maps.